I don't have a great plan for this introductory bit because I was not planning on having to do this. I thought that I was going to have one neat video talking about characters, but I am incapable of shutting up. So I need to split it into two, which means I need to have yet another introduction for the next set. The next two groupings of characters. I said there were going to be 4 groupings, and I only got through 2 of them because I have a chatting problem. So this one is going to continue on with the character discussion, and we're going to talk about the second, or third and fourth groups of characters that I came up with. So thanks for coming back on in with that, and yeah, we can start off, as I think I hinted at the unexpected end of the last video, with the third grouping revolving around Fred Vincy and Mary Garth, of the incomparable cast of characters of Middlemarch by George Eliot, which you're all probably sick of hearing about by this point, but for anybody first coming, I'm Jessica, and I don't even remember if I said my name. That's terrible. And I have been discussing at length, ad nauseum, you might say, this here book, Middlemarch by George Eliot. And I only got halfway through my cast of characters on the last video, so here we go. So now we have the third grouping. Halfway through. Which is yet again revolving around a romantic couple. So the third pair of the novel, Fred Vincy, brother to Rosamond, so one of the other children of the mayor of Middlemarch, and Mary Garth, who is a local girl that Fred, grew up playing with. He's known her his entire life. And Fred is very much in love with Mary, and she is very hesitant to marry him. So quite unlike the other two sort of romantic relationships, this one does not happen in a rush. We spend pretty much the majority of the novel wondering if or when these two are going to get together. How's this going to go? And just as a clarification point, part of the reason they've both been, thrown together so much throughout their lives is because they share an uncle through marriage. So this uncle that they both have, had 2 marriages. His first marriage was to an aunt of Mary Garth's. She died. And then his second marriage is to an aunt of Fred Vincy's. So there's that. Okay, Fred first. Who is Fred? I think I struggled the most picking a passage for Fred, because Fred is painted for you in bits and pieces for quite a while. It's very much an ongoing portrait, and a lot of what you get of him is through other people or just interactions that you get to watch that he has. So, the first time we meet Fred is, him waking up late at home and then having a really sort of quintessentially sibling argument with Rosamond, and, then Rosamond has a chat with a friend, and they're discussing Fred, and then, Fred's father has to go talk to a local banker about some accusations somebody made about Fred, and they have a whole discussion about how Fred's been raised and what each of them think, because they are related through marriage, blah, blah, blah. So we don't really get that standard description, here's what Fred is like, until we've already had a lot of interactions with him. So we have a good idea of 3 things. Number 1, Fred is aimlessly idle. He's dropped out of, he went to school, but he dropped out, he didn't finish. Number 2, he is good-natured but entitled. Charming guy, but absolutely no reality-based understanding of money. And number 3, he is desperately in love with Mary Garth. Perhaps his most redeeming quality to a lot of readers. So, with all of that, I finally decided to pick a passage that's actually a fair way into the novel in book 3, I think. And after we kind of have a fair handle on his faults and virtues, so in this passage he is sort of contemplating the pickle, if you will, he finds himself in with a rather large and inconvenient debt he is struggling to pay at this point. So we're on page 229, and here it is. This is chapter 23. I don't remember if I said that or not, but Fred had felt confident that he should meet the bill himself, having ample funds at disposal in his own hopefulness. You will hardly demand that his confidence should have a basis in external facts. Such confidence, we know, is something less coarse and materialistic. It is a comfortable disposition, leading us to expect that the wisdom of Providence or the folly of our friends, the mysteries of luck or the still greater mystery of our high individual value in the universe, will bring about agreeable issues, such as are consistent with our good taste in costume and our general preference for the best style of thing. Fred felt sure he should have a present from his uncle, that he should have a run of luck, that by dint of swapping, he should gradually metamorphose a horse worth 40 pounds into a horse that would fetch 100 at any moment. Judgment being always equivalent to an unspecified sum in hard cash. Wonderful. So of course this is a very money-minded passage. As I said, you know, he's stewing about this debt he's having trouble paying. But with an emphasis on absolute lack of knowledge about it, right? So it's all about money, but also very clear, like, Fred's shit with money. He doesn't have a, like, reality-based understanding of money. So he's stressing about it, but he doesn't really grasp how hot the water is that he's in, right? Yeah, and so I think there are just some really great words, like when I'm, you know, speaking of key words, as I mentioned them, you know, 15 years ago when this video started, you know, just have some really good ones that we can pick out to describe him. Hopeful, comfortable, agreeable, individual, confident, unspecified. Like, these are all really good words to describe Fred. You know, he doesn't actually have the money, but he's hopeful that he will. You know, just through some alchemical mixing of luck and providence and personal virtue or presence. You know, and obviously this is only a mindset you could have if you were very used to existing in a position of privilege, right? You know, we're not coming out and saying that, but I think it's implied. And once again, I find you once again heard me giggling. Like, I find the narrative voice to be so dryly ironic and sarcastic at several points in this passage. You know, you'll hardly demand that his confidence should have basis in external facts. You know, judgment always being equivalent to an unspecified sum in hard cash. Like, it's just, oh, the sarcasm of it all. It's so funny. And I haven't mentioned this before now, I probably should have, but George Eliot is so funny. She's so funny. That's probably a better thing to discuss in a conversation about the themes of the book, though. So, I think, incidentally, once again, we'll just scurry down another rabbit hole. It's fine. I really do want to point out that I find it interesting how hard a lot of readers seem to be on Fred. It's not that he doesn't deserve criticism. He does. Like, he's abysmal with money. He is, you know, often lacking in accountability because he's spoiled and privileged. You know, I get it. But I do think it's not quite right to describe him as he often is described, you know, i.e. that, like, his love for Mary is kind of the only likable thing about him, and otherwise he's just sort of a chump. like, I understand how you would get there. Like, I'm not crapping all over that necessarily, but I just think it's worth pointing out that he is one of the few male characters in this book who is not a politely raging misogynist. You know, he genuinely loves his mother, rightly reads his deeply flawed sister to filth on multiple occasions. You know, he brings books to the woman he loves because he knows she's trapped in an absolute intellectual prison, being caretaker to her grumpy old uncle. And he places a lot of value on his potential mother-in-law's good opinion. Like, it just, the list goes on and on. And it just feels like a really striking contrast to me. And he's not the only male character in the book who's like this, but one of very few who sees women as full people and is a pretty good judge of their character. Like, unlike Mr. Brooke, like, he sees women as full individual people with personalities and goes accordingly. That's no small thing to me in this time period, right? In 1829. And he does, unlike a lot of the other male characters, undergo a lot of change throughout the book. Like, he is trying to do the right thing. You know, he's bumbling, he's poorly informed, he's spoiled, he's often out of touch with reality, but, you know, by God, the man really does try hard. And, you know, he is trying to rise above the poor parenting and indulgent tendencies, and he does eventually grasp a good work ethic, you know. He's not perfect, but he's trying, and, you know, I think he gets a lot of brownie points for me from that, and I think he gets brownie points from the narrative voice as well. You know, there's no small amount of narrative moralizing, I think, about how much this is worth, because in the end, Fred is one of the very few men in this novel who end up with a happy marriage of equals, right? So, spoiler, I guess. I mean, not really, but okay. So yeah, just, you know, food for thought, I guess. And speaking of equals, time to discuss his romantic counterpart, Mary Garth. So she is of a lower class than the Vinceys. But even so, as I mentioned earlier, is connected to that family through marriage. So here's her passage. It's from chapter 12, page 113. Okay. Her shrewdness had a streak of satiric bitterness, continually renewed and never carried utterly out of sight, except by a strong current of gratitude toward those who, instead of telling her that she ought to be contented, did something to make her so. Advancing womanhood had tempered her plainness, which was of a good human sort, such as the mothers of our race have very commonly worn in all latitudes under a more or less becoming headgear. Rembrandt would have painted her with pleasure, and would have made her broad features look out of the canvas with intelligent honesty. For honesty, truth-telling fairness, was Mary's reigning virtue. She neither tried to create illusions nor indulged in them for her own behoof, and when she was in a good mood, she had humor enough in her to laugh at herself. So, I mean, I think it's pretty apparent that this is one of the most undiluted complimentary descriptions we've gotten thus far. So what does this tell us about Mary? Obviously, she's unflinchingly honest. I think that's very clear. She is smart, almost to the point of being cynical. You know, it's described as a shrewdness, which I think is an interesting word to interject to talk about her intellect. And she highly values action. You know, people who put their money where their mouths are, which is going to become a very important plot point in her potential relationship with Fred. Also, not classically beautiful. Very clear. This entire description of her comes during a visit that Rosamond pays her. You know, they're friends. She's also known Rosamond her whole life, and Rosamond comes over to visit her at grumpy old uncle's house, and you know, they're hanging out upstairs and chatting, and there's this really, like, almost comically over the top description of Rosamond, who is just, you know, sort of angelically gorgeous. And then we get this description of Mary. So to me, the comparison's very clear. Especially after you've read more of the book or finished the book, you know, and you go back to this passage, comparing them, it's very much a, you know, here's a woman who is so conventionally beautiful, but personality sucks. And here is a woman who is not conventionally beautiful, but she has a wonderfully interesting personality. And I can't help but think about George Eliot herself when looking at this comparison, because she herself was one such, you know, not beautiful woman. She was, I think, rather cruelly characterized by some people. But nonetheless, she had an amazing mind and was, by all accounts, just intellectually dazzling when you went to her home. So, you know, this made me think about that. So, within the sphere of Mary and Fred, you know, this third character grouping, we get introduced to the characters of Mr. Featherstone. What a name. I can't stand it. We'll talk about it. You know, the uncle they haven't, you know, the grumpy old uncle I've been talking about this whole time. That's him, Mr. Featherstone, and Mary Garth's parents, Caleb and Susan. So, Mr. Featherstone, then. So this is from chapter 34, page 323, right at the beginning of book 4. Old Featherstone had not been a harpagon whose passions had all been devoured by the ever lean and ever hungry passion of saving, and who would drive a bargain with his undertaker beforehand. He loved money, but he also loved to spend it, in gratifying his peculiar tastes, and perhaps he loved it best of all, as a means of making others feel his power more or less uncomfortably. So I was very deeply tempted to have a much longer quotation because, you know, that description continues on for the rest of a very long paragraph, but I think we can get the gist. And also, quite embarrassingly, I looked up harpagon and then promptly forgot to write it down, and now I'm completely blanking on that reference. So, sorry. I guess you can go look it up. Wow, that's embarrassing. Anywho, Mr. Featherstone is old, he's very wealthy, and boy oh boy is he cantankerous, right? You know, he's not a Scrooge, right? That's very clear. He's not averse to spending the money that he has, but only because he enjoys spending it in such a way that make other people feel beholden to him, right? Which, like, speaks to a very specific kind of manipulative person. You know, a cunning person, maybe a power-hungry person. You know, he wants to be able to lord it over other people. That is what brings him the most enjoyment with his money. And as the description also says, peculiar, like a weird guy. And so I think this is really kind of interesting dual nature that's, you know, sort of fleshed out as we go through the book, is just really hilariously suggested by his name. Featherstone. What a lovely paradoxical name. A feather and a stone. And as I said, the paradoxes within his personality are definitely clearly illustrated as we go along. So, I already mentioned this is the man who connects Mary Garth and Fred Vincy. And they are each beholden to him in a particular way, which I would argue he knows and enjoys and takes advantage of in mean-spirited ways at different points. So I kind of alluded to this, but, you know, Mary works as a caretaker for him to generate some money and an income to help her family and avoid the, you know, wretchedness of being a governess, as I think is implied. And Fred basically spends a fair bit of time, you know, visiting him and schmoozing, because he suspects he may be a weighty contestant to inherit the childless Featherstone's fortune when he dies. And he is at this point quite elderly and feeble, which is, adding to the grumpiness factor. So, yeah. So yes, I just, he's not like a lovable character per se, but there's something about him. So yes, I think that's the important things to look at for him. So then we have Mary Garth's parents, Caleb and Susan, and they become embroiled in multiple problems due to Fred Vincy and the aforementioned deaths. So yes, so Caleb Garth, chapter 23, page 232. Once again, why didn't we mark anything? Okay. And this is a bit long, but I just, couldn't stand it, so. All right. A large amount of painful experience had not sufficed to make Caleb Garth cautious about his own affairs, or distrustful of his fellow men when they had not proved themselves untrustworthy. And he had the highest opinion of Fred, was, quote, sure the lad would turn out well, an open, affectionate fellow with a good bottom to his character. You might trust him for anything. That's Caleb talking. Such was Caleb's psychological argument. He was one of those rare men who are rigid to themselves and indulgent to others. He had a certain shame about his neighbor's errors and never spoke of them willingly. Hence, he was not likely to divert his mind from the best mode of hardening timber and other ingenious devices in order to preconceive those errors. If he had to blame anyone, it was necessary for him to move all the papers within his reach, or describe various diagrams with his stick, or make calculations with the odd money in his pocket before he could begin. And he would rather do other men's work than find fault with their doing. I fear he was a bad disciplinarian. So that's Caleb. Love that. For the 18th time, a glorious description. To me, it brings to mind that saying when people talk about someone who is polite to their own detriment. Caleb seems like that. He is himself such a hardworking, genuine, optimistic, trustworthy person that he has an incredibly hard time recognizing when someone else isn't, right? And he loves his work. He genuinely loves his work so much. He's an action-driven person who just wants to believe the best in people and he's not motivated by money. He's just motivated by the joy the work brings him. And as with lots of other characters, and I could talk about this more, maybe I should have, but I think I've done enough talking. We all know somebody like this. These characters are so relatable. You read about them and you're like, oh, yep, I know somebody just like that. We all know somebody that makes us go like, get a grip, Pollyanna. Like, just because you're nice doesn't mean that everybody else is, right? Lose the rose-colored glasses. Like, I think we all know a person like that. And I also think it's interesting that this is one of the few instances where the narrative voice is incredibly direct. I fear he was a bad disciplinarian. That is so different, by the way, from just saying he was a bad disciplinarian or his wife felt that he was a bad disciplinarian. No. The narrative voice saying, I fear he was a bad disciplinarian. It's sort of like this omniscient verdict stating it that way. I fear it, and so maybe you should fear what comes of it. I kind of feel like that's what we're doing with that. And so anyway, I just, the implication is that this is a very good man with very poor self-preservational instincts. And we see this play out in several ways as the novel progresses. And I love the inclusion of like discussing all the little material items, like with distinct utility at the end of the passage, the papers, the diagrams, the odd bits of money, pockets, it's such a clever way to present a man so wholly focused on material things, how things work, how to make a better product. You know, earlier in the passage, what does it talk about? You know, the best mode of hardening timber, right? Like, those are the kinds of things he's interested in. So, you know, in order to even get him to the point where he could think about such things as somebody else's character, you know, you have to wade through all the detritus of his work and interest. That's just not important to him. So then his wife, Susan Garth, from chapter 24, page 242, not too far past his. And actually, this was a very, very long paragraph. And it's, I mean, it's brilliant. We could read the whole thing, but, like, you know, let's not torture ourselves. I'm trying, you know, I broke it up into two. So, but I think I'll just read it as though it is one passage, even though there's a middle section that I cut out for brevity. So, in her present matronly age, at least, Mrs. Garth never committed herself by over hasty speech, having, as she said, borne the yoke in her youth and learned self-control. She had that rare sense which discerns what is unalterable and submits to it without murmuring. She was apt to be a little severe toward her own sex, which in her opinion was framed to be entirely subordinate. On the other hand, she was disproportionately indulgent toward the failings of men, and was often heard to say that these were natural. All right. There is Susan. So Mrs. Garth is obviously very self-controlled, to the point of being self-abnegating, perhaps, I think would be fair. And very interestingly, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, it says a little earlier on in that part of the text that Fred is in awe of her much more than he is of her husband, Caleb, which I think is quite telling of both of their personalities, right? This is a very smart woman, a very controlled woman, but also a woman with a lot of internalized misogyny. You know, this is one of the clearest descriptions of that in the book, I think, which is part of why I picked it. You know, she has very much ingested some problematic ideas about, you know, the natural state of men and women. And even so, I like Mr. and Mrs. Garth together, watching their relationship. You know, I think you as the reader are like, okay, seeing them, I understand why Mary is the way that she is. And they, I think, are certainly one of the marriages in the book that are one of the few that is healthy, that is, for the most part, like a meeting of equal minds. They really respect each other. They see each other clearly, warts and all, right? And you know, once again, as the opinion about town, you know, the Greek chorus, as I keep calling it, of the town, is that Susan Garth is eccentric, as I think they say, which is kind of born of the fact that she's well educated, but, you know, kind of fell below that a little bit in who she married, and is completely uninterested in gossip. She and her husband share that, incidentally. Susan and Caleb both, like, they do not care. They don't want to talk about people. They don't want to go spreading stories about people to any of their neighbors. Not into it. They don't care. They're not interested. And it seems very telling to me that their lack of involvement in town gossip gets them labeled as eccentric by the town at large. I just feel like that's a really brilliant characterization of small town life. You know, if you don't join in disparaging people or events, you're going to be ostracized yourself. Like, it's just delightful. I feel like anyone who's ever lived in a small town, which I definitely have, like, you get that. You immediately are like, yeah, So, okay, we finally made it. We are at the final character grouping, which incidentally isn't so much a grouping as the other three. it's not centering around like a romantic couple the way the other ones are. So it was interesting to me when I watched review videos or lectures, or read, written book reviews maybe. I would often notice that this last person I'm going to discuss, Nicholas Bulstrode, didn't usually get quite as much airtime as the other three main romantic couples often do. It wasn't unilaterally true, but it was often true. And, as far as character explanation, the three couples were discussed a lot, rightly, I think. But Mr. Bulstrode often seems to get kind of overlooked, I guess. And this is strange to me, honestly, because if the three couples are if you want to think of them as the foundation of this novel, then, I find Mr. Bulstrode to be the roof. It's an overwrought housing metaphor, but I'm trying, okay? I guess all I mean by that is, the couples hold up the main structure of the novel in terms of the plot, but it seems to me that Mr. Bulstrode's journey is the overarching cover that kind of brings it all together thematically. So he is the guy who is, in a meaningful way, connected to all three of these character groupings I've been, yammering on about for however long. And without him, none of the other plot paths end up the way that they do, without him being in the mix. So, I think he's really important, both thematically and structurally for the novel. He's the grout in between all the tiling. We'll just keep using bad housing metaphors. It's fine. It's totally fine. So who is this? Who is this man? He is the town banker, married to one of Mr. Vincy, the mayor, one of his sisters, named Harriet. But interestingly, he's also this sort of self-appointed religious proselytizer. He's an evangelical Methodist. I know, I don't have pearls to clutch, but I have a necklace. Yep, which is, the whole thing that garners public suspicion in the town. And he very much uses his financial position to really ham-handedly push certain religious ideas on the people of Middlemarch in pretty obvious ways. So, but yeah, his official profession is banker. And, as such, he wields a lot of power over people in this town via loans, contracts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Bulstrode has the double honor of being last and also being the character who gets the longest quotation. Because any of my quotations have been short, not really. I tried to avoid it, but I think it'll be worth it. I think it's clear after I read it maybe why I picked this. So this is from chapter 13, page 123. Yet again, didn't mark it because reasons. Okay. The banker's speech was fluent, but it was also copious, and he used up an appreciable amount of time in brief, meditative pauses. Do not imagine his sickly aspect to have been of the yellow, black-haired sort. He had a pale blonde skin, thin, gray besprinkled brown hair, light gray eyes, and a large forehead. Loud men called his subdued tone an undertone, and sometimes implied that it was inconsistent with openness. Though there seems to be no reason why a loud man should not be given to concealment of anything except his own voice, unless it can be shown that Holy Writ has placed the seat of candor in the lungs. Mr. Bulstrode had also a deferential bending attitude in listening, and an apparently fixed attentiveness in his eyes, which made those persons who thought themselves worth hearing infer that he was seeking the utmost improvement from their discourse. Others, who expected to make no great figure, disliked this kind of moral lantern turned on them. If you are not proud of your cellar, there is no thrill of satisfaction in seeing your guest hold up his wine glass to the light and look judicial. Such joys are reserved for conscience merit. Hence, Mr. Bulstrode's close attention was not agreeable to the publicans and sinners in Middlemarch. It was attributed by some to his being a Pharisee, and by others to his being evangelical. Less superficial reasoners among them wished to know who his father and grandfather were, observing that 25 years ago nobody had ever heard of a Bulstrode in Middlemarch. Isn't it great? Don't you love it? Oh, I feel like this book really lends itself to being read out loud, incidentally. So, I mean, I hope it's obvious why I chose this in full. It's just such a great portrait of this man. It's so funny. Oh my gosh. You know, unless Holy Writ placed the seed of candor in the lungs, right? The sarcasm. Gosh, she's so funny. Anyway, Bulstrode. He tends to be loquacious. He talks a lot, but in a quiet way. He has this very solemn long-windedness. He is small, a bit ill-looking, physically inconsequential, and as I think is pretty clear from the description, very polarizing, right? People either love him because they feel like he's a serious listener who, you know, through his minute attention can put just a stamp of approval on their perceived morality. Or they hate him because they feel like this, you know, close attention reads like judgment and smugness, and they don't like it. So, also throughout this quotation is, you know, once again, that very clear Greek chorus voice of the town at large. You know, even though this man has a lot of financial power and a lot of people are indebted to him, as becomes clear throughout the book, he is still regarded with a lot of suspicion, both because he doesn't have, like, you know, the right religious proclivities, you know, the accepted popular form of Christianity, and because he's a transplant. You know, and what's so funny about that to me is, you know, Bulstrode didn't just get to Middlemarch yesterday. You know, it's clear he's been there for at least a few decades and has even married into a prominent Middlemarch family, and has a lot of financial power. But even so, like, there's this narrative of him being an interloper, right? Again, just such a beautiful illustration of small town life. Again, anybody who's lived in a small town, you know exactly what Eliot means by this. You know, even if you moved there 20 years ago and you've been there and you haven't left since you got there 20 years ago, you know, well, you didn't, you know, your dad and your grandpa weren't from here, so not a true member of the tribe, I don't think, right? Like, this very sort of like good old boys club kind of thing. So we finish finally with this small, quiet, very pious, very exacting man who holds the purse strings of this town, right? And kicks up a lot of polarizing opinions. That seems like a good place to end at. And so we've been introduced to all our main characters, which you won't believe me when I say this, but this is a little bit soul-crushing to me that these are the only people we've discussed, because there's so many characters I didn't even get to who are so delightful. There's such great color. They're so fabulously described. Yeah, Mrs. Cadwallader, Mr. Mumsy, Joshua Rigg, Mr. Raffles. Oh, well, okay. We only have so much time, but I mean, there's so many delightful people in this book. But, you know, I had to choose my battles, okay? I could have been completely crazy. And I'm sure you're like, this is the non-crazy version. Yes, It's scary, isn't it? But anyway, we have an idea of who these main characters are, their motivations, their strengths, their flaws, so hooray! Yay! Thank you for sticking around, for once again letting me yammer on incessantly. We'll see if I can knock out another one of these, maybe next time discussing the plot. The plot and the themes. I hope this was helpful and interesting, which is really my only goal at this point, beyond creating some joy for myself by, as I said, yapping incessantly about books that I love. I feel like we can all use little pockets of joy as often as we can in this world. So yeah, I hope you have a great day.